In this section, we want to talk about inherent risks to residual risks. We also want to talk about the various controls or the various questionnaires that we are going to send and the kind of questions that we are going to send. Now, when we talk about inherent risk, we are saying that inherent risk is the level of risk simply based on the nature of the relationship that the business is going to have with a third party. And so this is risk before we put in any control or any measures. Now, ratings. These are the calculated results and cannot be subjective. And we say that in a sense that it needs to be based on evidences, so it needs to be based on the inherent risk questionnaires that we sent out and the responses that you had. Then we have vendor due diligence. Now, the vendor due diligence is a process to review the vendor's organization, operations, and control environment. Now, this is done after we send out our inherent risk questionnaire, the business response, we check the ratings, and the ratings are high or critical. Then now we want to be able to have a conversation with the vendor. Now, we have controls. Controls are the risk management methods, tools, or processes used to reduce or mitigate risk. This can be on either the vendor or the customer side. And so controls are the measures that we are putting in place to make sure that our system is secure. So when we are having conversations with the vendor, we want to be able to find out from the vendor what controls do they have in place. We do this by asking them questions. And those questionnaires, the responses is going to give us an idea whether the vendor has those controls in place. Then we have what we call residual risk. Now, the residual risk is a risk that is being considered after we have had those conversations with the vendor. And so any risk after we have put in controls is what we call residual risk. So we say that residual risk considers the effectiveness of the processes, activities to reduce risk controls, both internally and externally. And so now you understand what vendor risk is, you know what the due diligence is, you know controls, and you know residual risk. Now let's get into some of the questions that is being asked. Now during the inherent risk questionnaire, some of the questions that we are being asked, now remember the risks have been segmented into various categories. We have data classification and sensitivity, we have third-party vendor risks, we have system technology, we talked about the operational risks and the financial and regulatory risks. Now, some of the questions that we are trying to find out, we are asking them, does the system handle sensitive data? Or that the system going to process PI? What is the estimated volume of sensitive data that is being processed? Now, the data classification also helps to be able to determine the risk exposure level of each engagement. Now, all these questions will be submitted to the business. Now, we also talked about the third-party risk where we are finding out that does this involve any external vendor or a service provider? Where is the vendor going to be located? The technology risk, which talks about the fact that what type of system is being going to be accessed. What level of availability is actually required? Then the financial data or financial risk that talks about what is the estimated financial impact if the system or services fails. Are there any regulatory or compliance requirements? And all these things are questions or inherent risk questionnaire that we ask the business unit. Now, when the business unit gives us these responses, as the analyst, my job is to be able to analyze all these responses, make sure that the questions that they have answered is in relation to their engagement and it makes sense. Why do I say that? I say that in the sense that if the system is going to tell us that, hey, this is going to be a software as a service, but they are telling us that, hey, it's a software as a service, but they're not going to process PI. How is that possible? What kind of data are they going to process? If they are processing PI, is it highly classified or highly restricted or a restricted kind of data? And so, as an analyst, your job is to be able to do that kind of analysis. Now, from inherent risk to residual risk. Now remember, when the inherent risk is measured without considering the mitigation controls or the controls that are involved, and that is where we call it inherent risk. In inherent risk, the mitigation factors over here, we have not consulted the mitigation factors. We are only looking at the inherent risk that is involved. And that is what is going to give us the inherent risk rating. Our goal of that is to be able to determine the risks that is involved before we even have a conversation with the business. And so over here, we are looking at the operational risks, compliance risks, transactional risks, and the risks that is involving a cybersecurity posture or cybersecurity risks. Now, residual risks is determined after you have considered and verified the controls. And so when we go through the risk level, we realize that, hey, it's a moderate or it's a high or it's a very high. We say, okay, then we want to be able to have a conversation with the vendor. In our quest to have a conversation with the vendor, we are trying to find out what are the controls that the vendor has in place. And so during the operational risks, we are asking the vendor, have they tested their business continuity plans? Do they have current licensing? Are they ISO certified? Is the transaction going to involve PCI? Are they certified? Do they have a SOC 2 Type 2 report? And so all these questions that we are asking the vendor is what is going to give us what we call the residual risks. Why? Because after they have put controls in place, we want to be able to make sure that we understand that after they have put controls in place, what else do we have? And that is where the residual risk also comes in. And so in assessing risks, we always say that if your inherent risk is high, your residual risk is still high. And if your inherent risk is high and your residual risk is high, you need to be able to stop and have a review of it. Why? Because your inherent risk is saying that the engagement itself is a high engagement. Now, when you are talking to the vendor, you realize that the residual risk is going to be high because maybe they don't have enough control that have been put in place. And so then there needs to be a pause where you need to be able to assess what the vendor has sent you and have a conversation with the business and find out from the business, can they look for another vendor or is this the only vendor that they have? Because this is a high risk engagement. Now, when your inherent risk is high and your residual risk is moderate or even low, then now you need to be able to establish timelines on when the next risk assessment is supposed to be done. That is what you need to know, when your next risk assessment is going to be done, when your residual risk is supposed to come in play. And I hope this actually makes sense to you. Now, a quick takeaways from what we did. We talked about inherent risk, we talked about residual risk. Inherent risk is risk that is in there before you put in controls. Residual risks are raised before you are putting controls. Now remember that assessments are internal documents completed by the business owner. Meaning that the business owner is the one that is making the request for that business. And so during the inherent risks, the assessment that is done, that the due diligence that is done during that time comes from the TPRM team, but the business owner is the one that fills it out. The inherent risk reflects the raw or untreated risk that is involved in the engagement. The inherent risk is also used to determine the risk management practices and routines that is necessary to manage the vendor throughout the relationship. Residual risk. Now, residual risk can only be determined after due diligence have been completed. And so after you have gone ahead to do your due diligence, the risk that is involved is what we call the residual risk. Now, this is used to determine if the risk treatment or the risk decisions are sufficient to be able to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And you must never be used to determine vendor risk assessment requirements or routines. Due diligence is also necessary to identify and be able to verify mitigation or to verify the risk mitigation controls. Why? Because in your quest of doing due diligence, you get to know what they have, what they do not have. Then you can now make recommendations on how they can mitigate those controls. Then periodic risk assessment or periodic risk reassessment and updated due diligence are essential to be able to take care of residual risk. So if you are not doing any of these, please, you need to be able to up your game and to be able to get this done. Now, I hope you understand what inherent risk is. How do we determine inherent risk in the TPRM program? You know what residual risk is, and how do we come about residual risk in the TPRM program? Catch you in the next class.